Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the fifth version of IHS's annual research conference, Urban Arc. We're very, very happy to have you all join online. Unfortunately, we would love to have you here in person, but that wasn't possible this year. We have a very exciting lineup of panels and papers over the next 3 days, and so we hope to see you all at most of these, if not all of them. I'd like to hand over now to our director, Aromar Revi, to open the conference. Over to you, Aro.
Thanks, Neha. Good morning. It's a pleasure to join you, sort of, at least in India, early in the morning. I know that people are coming in from various parts of the world and geographies. This is our annual research conference that IHS sort of runs and has been running for the last 5 years. It's an important event for us, and I think now, because we've been picking up on critical themes of sort of urban engagement over the last 5 years or so, has become, I would imagine, part of the international calendar for research in the urban sphere. But there is something that's a little bit different between Urban Arc and other conferences. The first thing that is that it's strongly focused on the global south. And when I mean the global south, especially in a COVID year, the global south is kind of present in pretty much all geographies, not only in Asia, Africa, Latin America, the traditional view of the south, but also, as we can see it, in all the asymmetries that we find in North America, Europe, and many other OECD countries, which have struggled as much as many of us have in other parts of the world. So that's the first thing, that this is strongly focused on the global south. Of course, we do look at questions of the interconnection between the global north and the south, because cities and urban systems provide us the opportunity to look at the nexus, the connections, the sort of interflows between these sort of larger constructs in some senses. The second thing is, very consciously over the last many years, we have focused on trying to provide a space for younger scholars to actually participate. And, we've done that partially because of our own experience at IHS. We are part of a country that is rapidly urbanizing. But of course, we're still a rural country. And the critical thing in that is that we don't actually have an adequate community of practice, research, and theory building that looks at some of these core questions. And one of the best ways of making that happen, outside conventional academia, which looks at things in somewhat stilted and disciplinary ways, is to provide the space for young scholars to actually engage with these questions, to also engage with other people from across the world. And as we've seen over the last many years, as we picked up critical themes, last year we were looking at questions of urban equality. We've also looked at urban and regional questions in the past. It provides us the opportunity to sort of talk across geographies, themes, disciplines, and provide younger people a place to kind of engage with these questions in their own local context, but also sort of internationally. So that's the other thing that's important. So in some senses, this year's theme tries to bring together a whole range of other questions that we've been trying to deal with. And it's not only us, it is something which I would call now sort of global urban community. And like Neha said, we're very excited about this year because we have a wide range of critical themes that we're looking at. There's, of course, something that's special because this is a year in which COVID has kind of dominated the lives of everybody in the urban space, I would say, pretty much across the world. So we do have a special, what you would call within quotes, a COVID track, which looks at the questions that COVID is throwing up before us and how responses and processes are working in different parts of the world. So apart from that, I think the interesting thing that we're trying to do here is to open up a dialogue on what forms of urbanism and what imaginations of urbanism are going to contest with each other in the next couple of decades or so. So there are a few things that I think are useful to kind of outline and emphasize in some senses. The first thing is, and that's pretty obvious, that the 21st century is going to be, in most parts of the globe, going to be a space in which urbanization, in a sense, is a megatrend. And when I mean a megatrend, there are sort of cliches about the world becoming fundamentally urban. We know that happened not so long ago. I would say just slightly over a decade ago, at least in demographic terms. The second thing, which is probably less obvious, but also very important in a year of massive economic disruptions is in terms of economic activity at least, the world had become largely urban in the 1990s. The question, of course, is of transition, and I think the transitions are not only things that are we can take as facts or sort of constructed facts, but the transition into economies that are dominated by urban systems. And when we're talking about urban systems here, we're not only talking about metropolitan areas and world cities, for example, which are a very important part of, let's say, the discourse of the maybe 80s and 90s, into a very different world at the moment. And in a sense, COVID has given us an opportunity to look at this in very sharp relief, because most of the hard and sort of sharp questions that we're dealing with at the current point of time, whether it's questions of dramatically increasing inequality or questions of governance. And we can see that even, I would say, in some of the most advanced economies of the world, who have been, or even now as we speak, are struggling with response to a pandemic, which actually, given the nature of resources they have, the histories of democracy and governance, etc., should have been a lot better. So there's a very interesting sort of sifting and sorting that's taken place in the last few months, which also relates to how these societies and how these economies are actually structured and organized. So, as part of this, within quotes, megatrend, one of the big questions that emerges is, where is innovation and where are these fundamental changes taking place? So obviously, North America and Europe urbanized over, in the case of Europe, maybe a few hundred years. In the case of North America, probably less than a century. But as we've seen from the largest urbanization in history, that is in China, we've seen that happening in maybe 2 generations or so. I still remember I worked a little bit in China. So when I started working there, almost, let's say, 20 years ago, one of the striking images I remember from one of the universities that I was teaching in was actually a representation of two imaginations in some senses. The Chinese imagination of the city, which is ordered, which is, in some senses, 2,500 years of organized urbanization, which has had continuity of a particular kind and organization, and it has a structure and form. It's a circle with a whole set of structures within that. And then on the other side, the Renaissance sort of image of Vitruvian man, and both of them were up on the same wall in one of the universities. And I think one of the challenges, at least at that point of time, because China was still trying to find its way around, trying to address modernity as it's received and it was constructed in China, along with ideas of urbanism. Some of them, I would say, somewhat unsustainable. China has, unfortunately, in some context, picked up the worst that is there from, let's say, northern or western urbanization. But really trying to balance out these two sort of contesting imaginaries. And these are just, I've given that to you as a meme in some senses. But across the world, and this is not a new question, this is a very old question in some sense, because the organization of states has often been tied to sort of iconic urban centers. So the imagination of urbanism, whether you go back into Egypt, which had a very strong tradition of urban engagement over about 1,500 years, or any of the sort of great early empires, the conception of urban centers, of city-states at one end, but also the construction of an empire in some senses, were tied to the concentration of culture, of wealth, of knowledge, of power in particular places that were there. And of course, this is part of that whole engagement around, let's say, an imperial phase of early kind of urbanism that we've seen in many other places. Now we find echoes of that in many places. But today there is this very interesting set of tensions, because this is not only a single imagination, there are many of them. Some of them are part of I would say, a critical discourse. So in our country, for example, we've been through many phases in India from the, let's say, late 1980s onwards, where there was an attempt, especially by political leaders, of trying to find sort of an iconic imagery or a symbol of what urbanism can look like. And in most cases, it was, let's say, outside the geographical frame or geographical boundaries of India. So at some point of time, you wanted to convert Mumbai into Shanghai. In other points of time, you wanted to make it like Singapore. At other points of time, you wanted to make it like Dubai and Doha, for example. Now, I picked up these examples because, in some senses, there is in the world, uh, let's say, in the dominant forms of discourse, especially in, let's say, dominant media at the moment, these ideas of what urbanism should be. And I think Singapore is a very interesting example. People in Singapore have done a remarkable job from when they started in the 60s to where they are just now. But the fact is that Singapore, or even Dubai or Doha, for that matter, or even the more interesting so-called green smart cities like Songdo, etc., are in many ways in the global urban fabric, and certainly in the fabric of the global south. They're singularities, they're exceptions. So I guess one of the questions is, if your imaginary that you're reaching out to is an exception, and that exception may be very particular and may have done very well for itself. The issue is, how does that translate out into the fabric of everyday urbanism? How does that translate out into the fabric of the kind of sort of inequalities and conflicts, and deep ones, that we're seeing in the current urban context, which sort of, like I said, COVID has thrown up many of these things, which are sort of plastered over by visions and articulations of the fact that the world was flat, that globalization was going to sort of save us all, and, let's say, new liberal engagement was going to actually construct new economies and new polities. And there was a period of time in which we were talking about the end of the end of particular forms of history in some senses. And we're finding very clearly, and this is not a new thing. I mean, historians, especially urban historians, have really shown us over a long period of time that these discontinuities are very much part of that ongoing sort of debate. These are not settled questions in some senses. So they are dominant sort of imaginaries. But I'd like to draw your attention to maybe sort of two or three themes that are useful to look at when we're looking at the questions of imaginaries. And many of them come from the epistemic frames that we use. So, the classic one, which is still in play in many parts of the world, and we've seen that even in the United Nations when we were debating and dealing with questions of sustainability, and that is a binary between the urban and the rural. That's actually, it's a binary that goes back maybe to the 17th and the 18th century. It had some value across much of the world at that point of time. To some extent, in the politics of let's say, South Asia and many parts of, let's say, Sub-Saharan Africa at the moment, it still has some value, because there are large proportions of the population who live in smaller places, who are dependent on agrarian and pastoral economies, and in a sense, they represent a very important part of the culture and history of, let's say, human activity of, if you like it, civilization. And there's, this is often set up as a binary, and especially in India, this has been a very important part of the discourse. We have been imagined, and our constitution has been constructed in some senses around an imaginary of India being, a place of whatever, 500,000 villages, and sort of an aggregation of village republics. And of course, that's only one imagination. There are many others that have contested in building us and taking us to where we are at the current point of time. But I would say this rural urban binary is, it's as far as fact is concerned, it's not true in most parts of the world, including those that are significantly urban, places that have hyper urbanized, like Latin America, since the 1960s to the current point of time. Of course, some more urban parts of North America and Europe. You have a residual, within quotes, sort of rural culture. You have something which really, in some senses, is very critical as we emerge in a world in which environmental conflict and climate change is important, because, in a sense, cities they can't support themselves as far as food and many critical ecological services are concerned, and especially in a world in which sort of natural products and things that we're creating have huge environmental consequences. We do have to go back, or we have to embrace new forms of production and consumption in which nature-based solutions, which is now a very sort of a fashionable world, but actually deals with agrarian cultures, deals with forests, that deals with nature as a way of trying to make sure that both sort of living and human systems actually sort of cohere and pull together. So that's sort of one part of the thing. The question, of course, that it leads on to is a question of the future of work, of the future of economic activity, and there are these sort of I would say binaries of a kind, and that is there's this appreciation of a standard model of development where urbanization and changing economic structure kind of walk in lockstep. And I think this is one of the challenges I think of Chinese urbanism, and we are embracing this in many other parts of the world, in especially in South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa. And I think these are things that do need to be interrogated, and they need to be interrogated because it is not inevitable that you land up in a world in which most people are engaged in service sector occupations. I mean, so the services are important in some senses, but the fact is that with a population of whatever it is, anywhere between 8 and 10 billion by the middle of the century, there will be other critical things that are required to sort of to underpin the material metabolism of our systems, even if they become more significantly urban. So it is not possible for us, at least in my understanding and imagination, to completely work in a world in which you have machines and precision agriculture, etc., which actually produce the food, the fiber, the ecosystem services, which is water and air, and the physical built environment that we will actually have to live in. So there, that's one part of it. The other part of it, of course, if you look at urban systems across the world, there's actually a significant, in a sense, a hierarchy or a connection between smaller places, intermediate towns, which are in fact the bulk of where things are actually going to change and work itself out, and of course large metropolitan cities. Now, because of the nature of power, because of the nature of economic activity and where wealth is organized, and where discourse in some senses emerges from, we have been strongly sort of overpowered, I would say, in the last, in the post-war period now, 70 years or so, by a metropolitan discourse. In fact, a lot of the theorization around world cities is not only about metropolitan discourses, but also metropolitan discourses in particular geographies. And that, I think, has been, it's been largely overturned. The central sort of the pivot of not only the global economy has moved towards the Indo-Pacific, but also the nature of both global and local urbanism. And in fact, if you really want to see where innovation is actually happening, you will see that much of that is happening at the moment in Asia, in Latin America, especially on dealing with questions of social innovation in many cases, and the challenges of urbanization as they emerge in highly unequal societies. And of course, the next big wave after South Asia is going to come in Sub-Saharan Africa. So the reason I'm laying that out is that a lot of what we have today are imaginaries that are drawn from geographies that have very different characteristics, not only in terms of culture and economic activity, but also in terms of its shared geographies and the kind of environments and risks that they're talking about. So there are strong path dependencies as far as urbanization is concerned. So this idea that there is a standard model and this is the way that we should go towards mega urban regions of 20 or 50 or sometimes more than that million people is something that I think is not only worth contesting and sort of and engaging with, but also something that will probably not be borne out by fact. I mean, India's reality, of course, is a classic example of that. It is going to be the largest urbanization we see here in the next 20 or 30 years or so, probably bigger than China because India's population is going to be larger than China's. And we're going to move to about a half urban state. So the interesting thing for us in South Asia is the opportunity of trying to keep an interesting balance between, earlier and I think pretty important ways of life, especially in a world, and when I'm talking about that, I'm talking about village and agrarian engagement. So I'm not saying that we have to be always confined to low productivity agriculture, which sort of keep people and very large populations in poverty and deep inequality for large periods of time. But with the technologies we have, with the kind of information systems that are obvious, and the new forms of social organization that are appearing, it is not inevitable that everybody has to live in large metropolitan centers. In fact, I think the facts speak to something else. The challenge, of course, is this imagination of, as I said, the binary between rural and urban at one end, and the binary, or at least a set of binaries, which says most people will not be working with their hands or with production activities or agriculture, but will be sitting and doing a whole range of things in the service sector, may not really be true. Especially because we're living much longer. Of course, the nature of work is changing. Now, within that, the most important reality that sort of strikes us from the global south, and especially in COVID, is the nature of that economy and the nature of work. Of course, it is significantly divided. There are huge gender and caste and sort of and ethnic and other asymmetries within that. But the fundamental asymmetry is the imagination of the organized sector in some senses. And as we've seen that with the significant displacements that have happened, the massive loss of, let's say, livelihoods, the earlier imagination of an industrial society in which you were either a wage laborer or you worked, let's say, in a sort of Japanese company for most of your life is changing. But the fact is that within quotes informality, the fact that a lot of the people who work across the world and try and earn their livelihoods in urban, peri-urban, and other settings are not going to be working for organized formal sector institutions. And there is a huge opportunity now for building up a system of social welfare, economic welfare, and in some senses, social protection, which can draw upon the experiences that come from, let's say, more advanced within quotes economies in other parts of the world, is an important question that I think we really absolutely have to grapple with. Because if we don't accept the fact that 90% of the people who are working, and very often a lot of women's work is not actually counted as work, are not supported by systems that would give them a full life. And life is no longer 40 or 50 years, it's 80 years or more. The nature of how urban centers and urban processes are organized is going to change very dramatically. The other question that's kind of that's part of this set of sort of limited imaginations is one of migration and movement. And there's a tremendous amount of disinformation on this. The fact is that in many parts of the world, especially the rapidly changing parts of the global south, a lot of the urban growth is driven, population growth is driven by what happens in the centers themselves. So it's not as if hordes of people from poor, rural, impoverished hinterland areas, and this is again another binary, are coming into urban areas and swamping them and destroying all the wonderful things that people do there. Is actually a very messy set of multiple circulations with a lot of complexity and a deep amount of precarity. Because the other thing that we don't often talk about is that, it's wonderful to talk about great imaginations of a world that's very prosperous and has pretty much all the positive things that urban centers can bring to us. But the fact is that for the last, as long as we've had cities have been sites of, and in some senses, their economies, their metabolism, and in many ways, their cultures of power have been driven by deep inequality. So what we're seeing thrown up by COVID today is in some senses a sort of articulation and a surfacing of something that we've known for the last 5,000 odd years. And that is the fundamental nature of urbanism, and what certain economists, and this is a particular view of how processes of urbanization actually work themselves out, because of sort of economies of scale, of agglomeration economies. Cities do bring together many positive things. They bring together all kinds of economic opportunity. They also concentrate a whole range of, like I said, cultural institutions, governance, power, wealth, etc. But they also are driven by a whole range of other questions, including the fact that, in many parts of the world and through a lot of urban history, poverty has been the underlying driver, in a sense that provides a potential difference that makes sure that urban centers are able to do this. Without poverty, we would not have seen the building of the kind of cities that we have. If you look at the people who actually build and maintain and run our urban centers, even in the 21st century, these so-called, fancy places, you find that they're typically large classes of people who have historically been disenfranchised, who have been hugely challenged and exploited. So poverty is an endemic part of urbanization. And imaginaries that try and only take one side of the coin and not others, that don't embrace both the sort of light and the dark side of what we're talking about, are, to my mind, bound to fail. Similarly, you have asymmetries of access. You have asymmetries of risk. Urban centers actually concentrate risk. And this is going to be a very deep existential crisis for us, because much of the recent urbanizations over the last, let's say, 30 or 40 years has been concentrated close to coastal zones and close to water. And this, that's a pretty obvious thing. Cities require a lot of resources, and historically they've been located in places where water has been an organizing principle, because human societies, for various reasons, need access to the coast, access to water to be able to survive. And in many ways, I would say one of the proximate risks, as far as we're concerned, in many cities, is going to be access to water and how we manage and deal with them. Because it's not only the city itself and the water it drinks, but the water that comes in terms of food, and is used in the production of many things. You cannot produce microchips, for example, and all the fancy 5G phones that we're looking at the moment without a tremendous amount of use of water. So the fundamental challenge here is in the fact that we concentrate risk, whether it's climate risk or other things, inside urban areas. So you're concentrating poverty, you're concentrating inequality, you're concentrating risk. And of course, obviously, without large urban centers, you would effectively not have endemic diseases. Like we've seen in the COVID example, COVID comes to us in the interface between the ecotone of a large metropolitan center, which is a global manufacturing hub in let's say in China. It comes because human systems are now encountering and pushing into ecosystems in which we have, let's say for the last few thousands of years, we've not developed the immunity to, or been able to accept certain kinds of organisms into our population. It comes into that center, it rapidly deploys itself in that center, and then because it's globally connected, you have a global crisis because the virus has transferred itself from one country to the other and then all the way through. And of course, if we shut down the air transportation system of the world, maybe hundreds of millions of people would not have got sick. We wouldn't have had the kind of mortality we had. So in a sense, this is a deeply urban crisis. It shows us what happens in a large urban planet where we don't look at, we're only looking at, let's say, the agglomeration and the wealth creation and sort of the improvement in the quality of material life questions, but not looking at the sort of ecological, the social, and other issues that are there. So I think when we're looking at imaginaries, especially in a post-COVID world, we have to embrace the more difficult side of things. And this idea of simple sort of classifications which use binary characteristics, or only look at one sector. So you only look at mobility, or you only look at health, or you only look at economic activity, don't work for us anymore. In fact, the challenge for us, I would imagine, in the next 10 or 20 years or so, is that we have to embrace this entire complexity, because we have created this world in which there are inevitably about 5 billion people going to live in urban areas. And all the consequent challenges of that are absolutely up and front in our face, whether it's environmental challenges or health issues or increased risk, etc. On the other side, we have huge and immense human potential. But because our social systems, because our systems of governance are not organized, or let's say they're organized around earlier imaginations, we have very significant challenges. So one of the deep challenges of imagination are questions of governance. So if you look at the history of governance over the last let's say a couple of thousand years or so, you have this at least constructed history of the organization of certain sets of societies around nation states. That's not completely true in every part of the world, but in certain parts of the world, and certainly within mainstream historical discourses, that's sort of one form of organization. And then came various forms of empire, which often have a strong urban component to it. And the best way to, in a sense, capture or take down an empire, in some senses, is to sort of go for the throat and go for the larger urban center, whether it's Istanbul or Rome or Xi'an or whatever it is, or Delhi or Agra in South Asia. That's the way that those processes play themselves out. But one of the challenges that we're facing today in a world that has gone within quotes beyond monarchy, which is now through a process of decolonization, has almost 200 members of the UN as states, is the question of, fair enough, we have 200 states and there is some contest, there is a certain amount of peace in the international system. It's not very well organized. There are all kinds of odd things that happen at various places. War is still a reality. Certainly, internal conflict within countries is an absolute reality as far as we're concerned. And violence within society, in some senses, may actually not have decreased in a dramatic way, especially when we're looking at gender-based violence in society. But the fact is that there's no way that we can manage these systems. We can govern these systems. We can enable a deepening of democracy, if that's what we really need to do, without looking at regional governance and questions of what happens in larger and smaller urban centers. Now, the fact is, and this is a very important part of the question of how imaginaries would play themselves out, the fact is that in the larger structure of the nation state, in the legal framework, in the constitutions of many parts of the world, and of course, this is a large and complex world with many countries in some senses. Uh, the urban imagination is actually very weak. And if the urban imagination continues to be weak in terms of how resources are mobilized, how economies are organized, how taxation works itself out, how intergovernmental fiscal systems actually play themselves out, and where power and legitimacy lie, then I think we have a severe challenge. So one of the things that I'm going to be kind of provoking you to do in the conversation that happen over the number of things that we deal with in the next 2 or 3 days is to look at how this works in our particular context. And it will be particular because these relate to frames of governance, they relate to cultures, they relate to legal systems, they relate to the way that power is currently organized and dealt with. But if we're not able to deal with these questions of governance, I think the imaginaries of physical places or imaginaries of great sort of moral victories or addressing particular asymmetries will not work themselves out in practice. So the imaginaries that we're talking about do have to not only address the sectoral questions, where do the water come from, how is your health systems organized, how do you deal with housing, those kind of things that we deal with, in terms of how cities and urban systems are organized, or other very critical questions: where do the resources come from, how does one deal with ecological footprints, how does one deal with the impacts of climate and risk, etc. But the core questions would be in many ways around how we govern our societies. What are the values that we really want to sort of hold on to? And what are those that are slipping away that may be really important for us? In some senses, in a world in which fossil fuels have peaked and are hopefully going to see a significant decline over the next 20 or 30 years, if we are in any way going to be able to reach anywhere like the 2 degree or 1.5 degree target as far as climate change is concerned, the nature of work and organization is going to shift. Much of what we see today is highly subsidized by the fact that we're using fossil energies and we're using fossil water and fossil resources to actually make this happen. And this comes from a regime of wealth creation, a regime of economic activity, of value creation and valorization, which may have to be seriously challenged. And that's what I mean by looking at the question of governance. And in some senses, many of us are starting to talk about the fact that there is an inter-urban system that's emerging, especially in the areas of innovation. We're seeing that becoming increasingly so. And if you look at the underlying subtext of the response to COVID, and has to be a multidimensional response because it's not only a health crisis, it's also a question of food security in other places. In other places, it's a question of deep inequalities and precarity in working conditions, et cetera, et cetera. So in some senses, urban areas are places where solutions are being created, are being put together, and are being operationalized, literally every day. And I've had the opportunity, because of a number of things that I'm involved in, to talk to leaders and speak with them and work with them pretty much across the world with mayors and their staff and stuff like that. And what we do find is a tremendous amount of innovation that's actually happening here. But the challenge in some senses is our imaginaries are caught either in historical sort of, utopias, or in ideas of, in some cases, the city on the hill, or other ideas of the singularity kind of city in some senses, which don't have a bearing either on what is possible and what is real and can deal with these multidimensional kind of opportunities, but certainly do not help us support some of the things that I think we really need to call out and deal with. Just making sure that we lift the floor for everybody. The fact that we do need to have systems that enable the fulfillment and the well-being of pretty much everybody, and we have the resources to do it. I mean, cities have created so much of wealth, so much of opportunity, but they are deeply divided and deeply concentrated. So we do need to address those questions and see how the innovation that's happening, let's say in small ways, can actually be spread. That urban kind of imaginations do start having a voice and resources and, within quote, some power, And I would say power not in the sort of imperial or the sort of expansionist view of things, but power to be able to act and bring together for everybody in their constituencies the kind of things that they would like to desire. Now, I mean, we do have, at least because of media and a whole range of let's say the democratization of education, the opportunity to make these changes. And in a sense, IHS is one of the institutions that is helping try to grapple with these questions. I'm not saying that we have an answer to everything, but we certainly have a fairly good handle on the core questions that need to be asked. So I mean, I try and close there basically by saying that our imaginaries, in some senses, define the set of propositions that we lay out to address the questions we're dealing with today. And in an urbanizing world which is complex, which is highly divided and unequal, we have to address these questions simultaneously, and we have to address them in systemic terms. Now, this is not the way that knowledge, universities, and innovation systems are currently organized. And there's a deep challenge there. I'm hoping that urban systems, because they lay out these things quite clearly, and you can see the interconnections weighing themselves out in everyday life, and COVID is showing that to us. You cannot deal with the pandemic without addressing economic questions, without addressing questions of social justice, and of course, deep environmental questions. The pandemic came because of an environmental breach in some senses back and forth. So we really have to try and sort of, I would say, reconstruct the process of engaging with these questions. And then, of course, in some senses, what is pretty obvious is the answers will always be local, but they do need to be connected regionally and globally. So there is this thing about urban systems, about the fact that they're multifaceted and they're multiscalar. So the ability to engage with multiscalar questions, with the responses across sectors, and of course, with the range of institutions that are required to deal with these questions in different places. And of course, the institutions themselves, there is no fixed pattern. They will be very different, even within a large federal country like India or Brazil or let's say United States. Or in some senses, if you look at the European Union or absolutely China, uh, you really have to be able to devise and create systems of knowledge creation and local centers of engagement between civil society, the academia, enterprise, and the state to be able to try and operationalize these questions. So I think the imaginary of the city which doesn't have a connection to the university or knowledge creation, in some senses, is a much older idea, and I think we're going to see, I hope at least, the dissemination and the building of local knowledges and local ways of understanding in a much more decentralized and a much more heterodox manner. So we're really glad to have you here. We're hoping that we're going to create the opportunity for these interesting conversations, and beyond the conversations, actual work to construct knowledge and address real problems in real places. And we'll try and bring this back each year so that we can try and build on this, challenge ourselves, and try and find new ways of proposing, being critical, and of course making changes in the real world in our knowledge systems. So thank you so much. It's a pleasure to have kind of opened this. I'll also be on the closing panel where we'll be looking at the convergence between three or four completely new kind of areas of knowledge creation, sustainability science, climate science, and what we're calling new urban science in some senses. We'll have a panel which has people from multiple parts of the world, and you'll see whether it's the global north or the south, we're dealing with similar questions, but of course in radically different contexts. So even though methods and processes may be somewhat similar, the fact that the application and the institutional context, the cultural context, the resource and the environmental context are different will actually throw up, I think, very interesting new ways of looking at the world. So thanks very much. I guess, Neha, maybe, I don't know how you want to run this, but we could, I can pick up questions or responses.
There are questions. We have about 10 minutes. If we'd like to, if there are any questions for Aro. Uh, if you could just type them into the chat, that would be great. I see a couple of hands up, so if you could just type the questions in, we can then ask Aro to respond.
Or I'm happy to take them if people want to come on live. That's entirely
Or
possible.
you can unmute yourself and speak.
Yes, please. Yeah.
Hello, thank you. My name is Sonigitu. That was a great presentation. My question is, how do we address the issue of population explosion and linking it into a coordinated approach for governance? Thank you.
Okay, interesting question. A very old one. It was kind of placed under the carpet for a long period of time. I think the interesting question of urbanization and, let's say, reproductive rights. I mean, there are sort of very conventional views of population and how it can be controlled, and one of it is effectively uh, one of the most dramatic examples of that is China, right? And it's a double-edged sword in some senses. The one-child policy, which was one of the most draconian, let's say, population experiments, did create a particular space and a particular form of, let's say, urbanization and public policy in China, which has enabled them to do many things. But if you know what's actually happening there, and especially the sort of move back in some senses, you have to look at this rather carefully. So the hukou and the one-child policy, in a sense, were, I would say, two critical sort of elements of the Chinese jigsaw that sort of connected things up from the 60s all the way up to the 2010s or so. And it did give them a space to do a number of things. In fact, the fascinating thing is that, and maybe the rather difficult and sad thing is, India is going to overtake the Chinese population in less than 3 or 4 years time. And India had its own engagement with questions of population control. But I think the evidence in many parts of the world is effectively, if you really focus early on education, on enabling equality, on enabling gender rights, and improving the quality of life, populations start dealing with themselves. The challenge, of course, is that this is culturally mediated. It's especially in our parts of the world, the sort of very strong drive, which comes from history, which comes from, let's say, culture and caste and gender, the son preference creates its own dynamics, which not only strengthens patriarchy in society, but also leads to a certain population dynamic. So, I mean, I think we have some fairly clear understanding of this in particular areas. Like I said, the obvious things are improved economic development, education, especially the education and empowerment of women, and their ability to take control of their own sort of reproductive rights in some senses, which is a deeply contested question, even in some of our most advanced democracies. They're very, these are very contentious questions. Are pretty well established at the population level of things that need to get done. And urban areas should be able to provide the space to make that happen. It's not actually true in many parts of the world, because you have memories that come from other places, you have social structures that come from other places, and people are living much longer. So there's an interesting dynamic that's playing itself out there. So yeah, China is one end of the spectrum, and I think many other countries, I would say Bangladesh, for example, is a dramatic example of where things can change very quickly in a generation or so. And even for a country that was a sort of LDC at one point of time, but is breaking into a different process.
Anna, there's a question on how to deal with working on inclusive cities.
Well, I think you first have to have inclusive institutions, fine. That's one of the biggest challenges we have. The thing is, like I said earlier, the structure of power in many parts of the world, and the structure of power in urban centers, and this is an old debate that we have, including with mayors across the world. And we said, okay, mayors are looking for greater agency in terms of their relationship with national government, but the relationship between mayors and mayoral government in many parts of the world and citizens is still very conflicted and confounded. So, you will have a contest for greater power and devolution of fiscal resources from the national capital to, let's say, an urban center, and you will have evictions happening at the same time. So inclusion is something that's built out of a certain frame of governance and an acceptance of basic principles. We know that it works very well, including in societies which have been dramatically unequal. I think some of the most important gains and some of the most important lessons for us of the struggles in, let's say, Latin America and other parts of the world is the fact that inclusion absolutely works. It works especially if it deals with economic questions. And it's not only inclusion to enable issues that deal with income. It's also critically related to wealth and property and access to resources. So whether you take something which is worked in many parts of the world, like participative budgeting, to actually having greater say in planning and processes, or even the right to be able to protest and struggle, and the ability to do that within certain social and cultural contexts. I think these are all sort of elements of that process. So the governance system and the framework that exists has to enable this. And in some parts of the world, that isn't possible because those conversations are still closed. And in other parts of the world, they were open and they're closing just now. And that's part of the debate that we're having in many locations about urban governance. So inclusion, I think, is a very critical value. It leads to tremendous outcomes. That's a reason why inequality sits in two critical elements of the Sustainable Development Goals. Gender equality and, sort of within quotes, economic inequality are central parts of that. But in many parts of the world, being able to create social inclusion is one of the most critical challenges, because you can have opportunities to create wealth and improve living conditions. But if social and gender asymmetries and other associated questions are not dealt with, it doesn't work for many parts of the world. Okay, we have a lot of questions from Nasir, yeah, on rental housing. And so, well, I mean, the rental housing question is something that it's very particular to particular geographies. In fact, even within geographies, it relates to the nature of the city that you're sitting in. So you can have a larger, a larger country, and what's happening in one particular market or one particular city could be very different from the other. So I guess, how does it relate to imaginaries? So in some parts of the world, one of the sort of core imaginaries is the idea that everybody should own a home. In some parts of the world, because of rural imagination, that home should be a homestead which has nobody living above it, right? So the idea of the single family dwelling, which is detached or semi-detached, is in a sense part of that imaginary. And you can see the structure of many cities, especially in Europe. If you go to London, for example, you find that Victorian imagination. You go to suburbia in many parts of the world. And because a car has enabled that, that's kind of a critical part of the imagination. So what's the relationship with that in rental housing? The critical question, I guess, is the nature of property and how it's organized in space, fine? And when, this is related to how land markets are organized, and land markets and labor markets, along with the infrastructure that connect them, effectively define the structure and organization of the city. So if rental markets have to work, there have to be spaces in which the economic basis, I mean, the share of people's incomes that they have will actually work in terms of being able to access rental housing. There also has to be stable conditions so that there's not so much inequality in access. And in some cases, they have to be, I think, fairly strong public interventions in this, whether it's, public housing, which has been around for the last, well, at least in its recent modern dimensions, the last 150 years or so in many parts, in some parts of the world, or in other cases, co-housing. So there are lots of different regimes that are there where we have to understand how, whether you're in a market-based system or in the old days, when there was still a large sort of Soviet community, there was state-provided housing. You need to look at it in those contexts. So I don't think it's an abstract question. This is very contextual, and especially because many kinds of economies have been making changes. If you look at what happened in the eastern part of Germany and then its integration into a larger German context, the nature of rental housing would change as it is in other parts of the world. So I think, I think this is an important question. Singapore, for example, the idea of rental housing has been very central to how they've looked at the urban fabric. So I think this is a particular thing which one should probably pick up in a context. You can't address it in the complete abstract. There's a question about health moving in India. I mean, urban health is actually a disaster as far as India is concerned, for multiple reasons. The first, I think, is because our health systems in India were imagined, and this is where the question of imaginaries has come up. It was imagined from a really rural context, and that was a very important reality, because even now India is, two-third urban and two-third rural and one-third urban. So you have to address questions of rural India. But the fact of rural India is that for a long period of time, infectious diseases have been the most important question to address. So the the health systems are organized around vertical infectious diseases programs, so tuberculosis for X and Y and Z, or let's say polio and childhood diseases and maternal health care, etc. Now, in the urban context, two things have changed. One, of course, the concentration, but more important, we are in the middle of a very deep demographic transition along with deep urban poverty and informality at the same point of time. So you have people in many urban areas in India who are poor, who will live for 8 years and will have to live with diabetes and with heart disease for 50 years or so. Our systems are not designed to deal with them because in urban centers, our health systems have been focused on two things. A, on tertiary healthcare, which effectively serves as primary healthcare, which is kind of insane and deeply problematic. And on the other hand, you have a system that has got increasingly taken over by private health providers, which means that it's unaffordable by a whole range of people. There are some very interesting experiments, especially we're seeing in places like Delhi, where they sort of a restructuring of the organization of urban healthcare. But the issue for us is not only healthcare, it's well-being. And well-being cannot be addressed unless you deal with questions of urban basic services and making sure that everybody has access to basic infrastructure, the housing conditions are adequate. The housing conditions that we've seen that people have had to deal with both pre and post-COVID are one of the reasons why transmission has either been more effective or not. And in some senses, the innovations that have come in this space have come because of community organization, because people are able to organize to deal with their context more than anything else. So there is, okay, I have a couple of other questions here. Neha, can you see anything else that we want to?
There's one. I mean, there's a question on sort of integrated, systemic cross-sector policies, and there's one other question on how the Indian urban discourse differs from the West, given our particularities. So I think we'll have to. I mean, we can take these and then.
Okay, I'll just take this quickly.
Yeah.
So the cross-sector question is an important one. The challenge, I think, is that national governments for the last couple of 100 years or so, since whatever the early 1800s or so, have been organized around sectoral, themes, fine, and the economies in some senses have been both imagined and organized. By looking at a social accounting matrix, you're looking at how the statistical system is organized and what you count and what you measure. Most of that is broken down by sector. Now that worked, and firms, of course, are organized that way. So if you look at these two critical organizing entities for a lot of our lives, both the firm and the large multinational firm, or even the other ones, and the state are organized sectorally. In actual fact, these are aspatial in their imagination, and this is, I think, an important question. There's a big struggle here, ontological, epistemological, and actually in practice. The reality of a very complex sort of urban ecosystem and an urban regional ecosystem is that all of these things blur into each other and they're deeply interconnected. And COVID is exactly an example of that. You have a crisis that starts in one sector and then permeates through the entire economy, either because you lock it down or you do a whole lot of other interesting and crazy things, fine? So the answer to a lot of the challenges we have are systemic, but it's not only systemic in the abstract, because you can deal with systemic engagement by sector too. It is systemic engagement in space and the interconnections in space that make a difference. And governments across the world, including municipal governments, including local governments, actually struggle with this. The challenge, I mean, the opportunity is the fact that municipal governments, because they're tied down, they have a particular sort of geographical area that they deal with, they have a jurisdiction, often maybe, at the largest, a few hundred square kilometers, in the best cases, maybe a few, tens of square kilometers. So they're small and you can meet things and see people. The opportunity to integrate and solve problems locally is much more real. And that's why we're seeing this innovation that I talked about, right? The challenge is the national systems, the systems and of governance, resourcing and control, and the institutional capacities are not organized spatially in that way in many parts of the world. So we have to learn, I would say, from those parts of the world that have done this better and try and integrate them in. But as we know, governance systems, the organization of markets and where wealth and stocks are created are very difficult to move. It takes sometimes many generations for things to move around, even in a world that's deeply connected. So there's a big space of innovation in this. And the only way that will happen is if we have more voice, both for the citizens and for people who are managing those systems. And finally, on the Indian question, I mean, India is a fairly mixed up place. There are lots of interesting things happening here. there is no such thing as an Indian way of doing things, because this is a region which has many realities, and sometimes some of them are in concert. In most cases, they're moving in multiple directions as far as that's concerned. So there are large number of things that are happening. But I would say as a heuristic, uh, I think one of the most fundamental questions that we will have to ask is a balance across this so-called rural-urban continuum. You know, how many hundreds of millions of people can live in sort of an agrarian context and have the quality of life and access to services that would allow them to stay connected to the land, because in some senses our culture is deeply connected to the land in many ways. Land, and I don't mean just agriculture, it's forests and other things. And when we're looking at sustainability and adaptation and resilience, these are very important characteristics for a more sustainable society that's based actually on the flow of bioresources rather than fossil fuels. So that's, I think, one critical question. The other question is, how does the nature of work and culture actually play itself out? And I think this is in deep context. It relates to social and cultural asymmetries. What people do and should know is that India and South Asia is a very stratified and highly unequal set of social systems. And I think that is entwined with the challenges and struggles that we will face around those questions, about questions of social justice, of equality, will be tied into how urban systems and structures will play themselves out, and vice versa. Certain things lock you into certain forms of engagement, do not provide certain people or certain sets of people or certain genders mobility, and as that changes, structure will change, and vice versa. So this is a very fertile space for engagement. This is why over the last many years, and we just closed it yesterday, we have held a PhD workshop, which basically has brought together a few hundred young scholars who work on South Asia from across the world, because the more scholars we have to engage with these questions, the more practitioners who engage with the scholars, the quicker we will be able to articulate the questions and then start trying to understand how to build scale and respond to these issues. So yes, if you're looking at for a fertile ground for engagement, like sort of East Asia was and still is one of the most important areas for urban innovation, I would say South Asia is, as is our colleagues in Africa. And of course, we owe a tremendous amount of debt to colleagues in Latin America and other parts of the world for really teaching us about how to do things or change things in very difficult circumstances. I know there are barriers of language and discourse, but the idea here is to bring together scholars, practitioners, and other people who are acting in this space from across the world, to try and show us how we can learn from them and how we can build new knowledges and new ways of doing things. So thank you so much for your attention and your time. It's been a pleasure being with you, and I hope to see more of you through this week as we pick up on these conversations. So
Thanks,
thank you.
Arok. Thank you all for joining. And we'll reconvene in about 20 minutes or so at 10:30 for the first panel on narratives of the urban environment. See you all there.